Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to another Galloway Glens event. We've been doing a number of these events now, and each one seems to be slightly different. And tonight we're really pushing the boat out with effectively 5 presentations, a load of maps, and some really different different sort of concepts that are going to be discussed tonight. Before we get started as well, I would also remind you we've got a number of other events coming up. And next Wednesday, we've got an event called To Migrate or Not to Migrate, discussing how Atlantic salmon migrate around the sea, the problems they face, and some kind of new technology which we're using to understand how these fish migrate through the River D system. So quite an exciting project. Shortly, I'll be handing over to Archie Mcconnell, I think, and I'll just unshare the screen. So shortly we'll be handing over to Archie Mcconnell, who's going to discuss the first maps we're going to be putting up, and then we'll go into the main presentation. So Archie, would you like to give us a little conversation about damp and what's going to be happening tonight?
Yeah, well, just for those who don't know about damp, we're an organization who collects old maps, gets them copied, and sticks them on the NLS website, which is a terrific asset really for everybody. The website's fantastic. It's got all the Ordnance Survey, all different kinds of maps, and it's just fun to have a Pluto around. But it's even more fun if you've got some local maps to go and have a look at as well. This evening, we've been organized so that we have all sorts of presentations and such like. And the reason that we're doing it this way is because when we look at a map, we all look at the map differently. And I hope the presentations that are to come are certainly going to show that. 2 things, though, I'd like to do is to thank very much those people who have prepared stuff for tonight. That's very kind indeed, and for sharing with us. And the other people I'd like to thank are the Galloway Glens for actually making this all happen, because I don't have a technological hat on. So this is great. So thanks, Nick and the guys. Okay, let's go to our first map here, which is a plan of Nether Corsic. And we'll go for Graham, archivist from the library at the Ewart in Dumfries. Fount of all knowledge, and he also enjoys his surveyors and his maps. So maybe Graham, you could start us off on this one.
Thanks very much, Archie. Now, first of all, I used to be the archivist, and I'm not anymore. So just in case anybody's wondering what's going on here. Now, secondly, this plan of Nether Corsic. I'm, as Archie said, going to talk mostly about the surveyors and 1 or 2 features on the map as well. And this map, as you can see, plan of Nether Corsic, lying in the parish of Parton, the property of Sir J. Clark, Baronet, surveyed July 1806 by John Gillen. Well, John Gillen, for anybody who's attended previous damp events, will know that I go on and on about John Gillen. And you've not had enough of him yet, because I'm going to give you more tonight, because 3 of the 4 maps we're going to look at in the panel are surveyed by John Gillen. But the first thing I'm going to start with, and I'll come back to Gillen and a bit about him, but one of the endearing things about Gillen is that he gets things wrong occasionally. And the very first thing he's got wrong on this map is in the cartouche itself here, where it says the property of Sir J. Clark, Baronet. Well, actually, Sir J. Clark, Baronet, died in 1798, and this map was surveyed in 1806. So we've got an immediate problem. And in fact, the owner of the estate in 1806 was Sir J. Clark, Baronet's son, John Clark Maxwell. And now, why Clark and then Clark Maxwell? Well, about 70 or so years before this, the Clarks had inherited the Middleby estate, of which this formed part, through marriage. and on the understanding that Maxwell would then form part of anybody's name who owned the Middleby estate. So that's where that comes from. Now, the Clarks were a quite amazing family, Scottish family, going through about 200 years. Sir Walter Scott actually said that the family had a hereditable, if I could only say it, hereditable genius. And I still can't say heritable genius. Thank you. Heritable genius. In other words, every generation of the family threw somebody up who was absolutely remarkable. From the second baronet, who was around in the early 18th century as a complete polymath, one of the great intellects of Scotland of his time, right through to Sir Walter Scott's time. And I'll just say one more thing about that when we come down to it. So we're going to now head down the page slightly. If that's it, thank you. And zoom in just a little bit upwards, and zoom in on the very left-hand margin. Sorry, a little bit upwards. That's it, keep going up, that's it. And zoom in on the left-hand margin. That's it, keep zooming. And you'll see here that he's put Ernmanach, this is going up the page, and then over Corsic crossed out. So there's one of a classic Gillen mistake. He does this all the time. And it's, like I say, I find it quite fun. And obviously people still kept employing him, so he can't have been that bad. And if we carry on further down the page, and that's it. And that's it. And you'll see in the middle there, a new farmstead. And that was built not long before this map was surveyed. And that is now Nether Corsic. And if you go directly down from there, that's it, keep going down. That's it. You'll see that's it, a group of buildings there, and it says old, well, it should say Old Steading. And another Gillen mistake, he's missed out the D. And that Old Steading became Glen Lair House. They built Glen Lair House on that site in about 1830. Now, Glen Lair House was where the biggest genius of this family of geniuses was born, James Clerk Maxwell. And if Walter Scott thought they'd done pretty well up to now, James Clerk Maxwell surpassed them all. And so it's a map that shows where he was going to be, and it's the place that he eventually inherited on the death of his father in 1856, and had it until he died himself in 1879. So that's enough for me on this map.
Okay, Peter, do you want to come in? This is Peter Norman. He's the ex-biodiversity officer from Dumfries and Galloway, and still working in bits and bobs up Ayrshire direction, I think. Peter, are you there?
Okay, yeah, I'm here. Thanks, Archie. I'm not going to say too much about this map, but I'm just going to, Graham's already pointed out that there's a new farmsteading, but the map is really about new all sorts of things. It's a map showing improvements which have probably just recently happened. So you'll see that Gillen's drawn the landforms in pretty artistically, but then Gillen or someone has taken his ruler and drawn some straight lines of where the fields go, and that's where the fields are today. It seems as if they were drawn from a desk rather than from in the field. Now, that is something which we would term today a part of the agricultural revolution. But bearing in mind that in Dumfries and Galloway, the agricultural revolution started in about 1720 and was still going in about 1850. So it wasn't really a revolution. It took a long time, and they didn't do everything at the same time. So you drew the fields in and divided it all up pretty squarely and neatly. But within the fields, there was still quite a lot of variation. And the table of contents in the top right, we don't need to go to it, but it lists what's in each field. And there's quite a lot of variation. A lot of the fields refer to areas of arable and areas of bog. which is not a combination you would get today. And that really just goes to show that the fields had been enclosed in this regular fashion, but the drainage of the fields hadn't really started by this time. That generally came much later in the agricultural revolution. That was all I wanted to say.
Thanks, Peter. If actually you stayed up in that corner, McNab, and you can see it says next door. I'm afraid I'm just going to point out another one of Gillen's mistakes. Just next door to there, it says Blackwall as being the neighbouring land. Blackwall's. It isn't. It's Black Hills that is the neighbouring farm here, and he should know that because actually there is an earlier map that was done of this particular one. And we forgot to practice this one, guys, I'm afraid. But on the PowerPoint presentation, there is a cartouche of the previous map, which is done by a guy called John Tate, who worked for one of those earlier John Clark Maxwell's, one of those earlier Clark Maxwell's, who was one of the, I think he put together the Royal Society and such like things, or helped to. He worked with the Duke of Buccleuch and all sorts of places, but he also hired.
Second baronet, Archie. That's the second baronet, Sir John Clark. Yeah.
Okay, the second baronet. Well, I think this is him. Is this? This is.
Oh, that's George. That was his son.
Graham, his son.
That was his son, George Clark Maxwell.
Yeah. This is 1752, so it's actually quite an early map, and this is probably the earliest map that we've got in the county of Kirkcudbright, shall we say. And it's one of the wonderful things about it is that it has an awful lot of color still in it. But anyway, so there is an earlier map of the place, and it still belongs to the Clark Maxwell family.
Thank you for that, guys. So John Gillam, great with a pen at drawing things, but not so great at remembering names and spelling. And as a diagnosed dyslexic, I've got great sympathy with him. Unfortunately, I'm not very good with a pen and can't draw either, so I'm not ever going to be a mapper. Our next presentation is Andy Nicholson. Andy Nicholson works for the council as the archaeologist, and he's going to do a presentation called You Can't Do That. Andy's been here for a number of years, starting off in the Whithorn dig, and it's kind of stuck around for a long time. He helps us out a lot at Galloway Glens with particularly one of my colleagues, Helen Kerran, and her Can You Dig It project, and has been involved with a number of Galloway Glens events. So I think Andy's going to get his screen up sharing shortly, and he's going to do a little talk about the work as an archaeologist and how he uses ancient maps across his work. So you ready to go, Andrew?
Ready to go.
It's one of those things that I'm an ecologist and I use ancient maps as well to find old things. It's great to see other people doing the same thing. Andrew, over to you.
You Can't Do That. The title of this lecture is derived from a comment made by our very own Archie Mcconnell when, during a conversation, I told him that I frequently use the National Library of Scotland's old mapping website in order to make informed decisions for modern planning, the council's archaeology service being based within the planning department. And map regression is one of the techniques that we frequently use in relation to historic environment assets. Take, for instance, a recent case to do with the woodland planting scheme. This is the area of Boggery Lane, shown on Ainsley's map of 1797. What will become the A75 is shown as the proposed new road running through the centre of the screen as a dotted line. The old military road is in the bottom right-hand corner, and the road we are interested in is the old road from Dumfries to Corsock, running along the top of the screen from Shorehead, along the edges of Pear Tree Hill, where the forestry application was, and Yew Bray. And it can be seen here marked on the council's GIS for the historic map environment, running along the top of the screen, highlighted in red here. So this shows you that we've gone through and checked the course of it. Now, as I said, the forestry application was in the area around Pear Tree Hill. And this is the line of the road as marked, shaded in brown, is the area of archaeological interest. We've been able to define this area by looking at taking Ainsley's map, then looking at the first edition Ordnance Survey map, where we can see running across the top of the screen an old fence line with a double line indicating where the road used to be, but running out by the time it gets just to the to the north of Pear Tree. And when you examine this on the aerial photographs, it can be seen quite clearly. If you look at the polygonal block of woodland on the left of the screen, you'll see the double wall line running below it, down to the angle, and then carrying on towards the top right-hand corner of the screen, highlighted in red here. So you have the double wall line on the left and then a single wall line continuing, and by the time you're towards the right-hand edge, the side of the road is marked by a hedge line. And when I went out to do a site visit, I managed to find the actual physical remnants of the road on the ground, with the upper bank just below the tree line and the lower bank running across the mid-ground as shown here. So we have actually managed to use Ainsley's map in order to locate the former road on the ground, as a result of which the planting scheme will still go ahead, but it will now leave a clear ground buffer so that the old road will still survive as a physical monument on the ground. And the case that actually inspired the original conversation with Archie was related to a wind farm application, and I was looking at the area of Shingle Water. This is Shingle Water as shown on Gordon's map, derived from Pont, but I'm using Gordon simply because it is a clearer depiction. And the group of farmsteads I was interested in particular, were the ones at the upper end of Shingle Water, running from Cormilligan and Craig and Kerm up to Shingle Head up at the top of the map. You will notice the farm of Croglin and the farm of Mid Shingle, and it's Mid Shingle in particular that was the one I was looking at. You'll see again that they're shown on Blau's maps with Cormilligan and Craig and Kerm, Appin and Auchenbrake, and heading up to Shingle Head at the top of the map. But you'll notice that contrary to Pont and Gordon, there is actually a mistake in Blau in that he has transposed the names for Mid Shingle and Croglin and applied them to the wrong farms on either side of the river. And this can be clearly seen even on modern mapping, where Croglin Craig is quite clearly on the one bank and Mid Shingle is on the other side. A number of the farms can be seen with the original names from Gordon can be seen in this. So Craig and Kerm, Old Auchenbrake, Cormilligan, Shingle Head, and Kilmark, all these names can still be seen and reflected in modern mapping. But as you can see, Croglin and Mid Shingle are no longer locatable directly on the ground. But we know from looking at the earlier mapping that Mid Shingle is somewhere between Auchenbrake and Shingle Head. And it's, at first glance, a barren piece of hillside, much as the Ordnance Survey map was showing. But when you look at modern aerial photographs and you go in fine detail, you can actually make out the lines of the rig and furrow on the modern aerial photographs and the lines of the field banks between them, which results in the ability to actually create the pattern of a whole field system. Now, Mid Shingle is somewhere between Auchenbrook and Shingle Head, and we now have clear evidence for an infield and an outfield system around a farmstead in the right location. It's even more clear when you apply modern technology, and this is the LiDAR coverage for the same area, in which the rig and furrow and the field boundaries can be very clearly seen. I must confess, Mid Shingle is still unlocated because we're doing all of this. I cannot yet see firm evidence for a building group, though there are indications of an area of ground with what may be two structures just to the left on the ridge, just to the left of the actual name tag, in which case my original placement of the Mid Shingle name, based on the fact on the historic mapping and it being on that side of the river, has actually been placed within 100 metres of the probable location of the farmstead based on all the archaeological evidence on the ground. And as a result of this, the area now has a brown buffer zone. This is an area of archaeological interest, which is a planning constraint that has now been applied to that area should it be affected by wind farm applications or for new applications for forestry planting. And to close with, to take us back to Pont and our earliest maps of the area, I was always fascinated by the sheer size of Enoch Castle when compared, for instance, with Drumland Rig or Morton Castle. And although you drive up there now on the road up to the pass and all you can see is recently felled forestry, there's not much other than a series of earthwork mounds on the ground that doesn't reflect the apparent substantial structure that Pont indicates. But when the tree felling was going ahead as part of the licence, I put in a request for an archaeological watching brief while they were cutting the tracks for the timber extraction, as a result of which we have actually found this 5 to 6 foot thick sandstone wall, which indicates to us that Pont's map is probably correct, and that under the trees and under the earthworks, what we have is a large and substantial stone medieval castle.
There you go.
Thank you. That's really useful. Actually, really interesting. The next presenter is going to be Henry Goff Cooper, who lives in Dunsker and farms just up the road from Dunsker. He's conducted archaeological digs on his farm already, and he's going to be talking about microtoponyms preserved by the 18th century border disputes.
Okay, slide 2, please. So, yes, thank you very much for inviting me to talk about this interesting map that Archie actually shoved at me. Very grateful to him. This is a plan which was made for an 18th century boundary dispute between the Laird of Dalswinton and the Earl of Nithsdale in the parish of Kirkmahoe. There are 2 surviving copies of the map, one in the Ewart Library in Dumfries and the other in the National Records of Scotland. The serial number is RHP6, if anyone's interested in chasing that. And this National Records of Scotland copy is the better preserved of the 2, but they are virtually identical. The plan probably dates to 1765 at the latest. So the plan covers an extensive area between Dalswinton and Duncow in Kirkmahoe, Dumfriesshire, with Smithtown and Quarrel Wood at the bottom to the south, and the march with Auchen Cairn in Closeburn at the top, at the north. Now, the crucial thing about these things is I'm interested in field names, microtoponyms, other small features. And of the 40 or so names found on the plan, only about a dozen survive into later surveys and to the present day. I hope you can see these okay. There are regrettably no field names. This was some 20 years before enclosure started in earnest, and only 4 dikes are noted as such, although other lines on the plan may well represent head dikes or simply limits to land holdings. The named dikes are the 2 Pennyland dikes, Nether and Upper Pennyland stone dikes, and the Quarrelwood dike, and the Smithtown dike. And these 3 settlements, Pennyland, Quarrelwood and Smithtown, are still extant today. You can find them on the present day Ordnance Survey maps. The plan does, however, preserve a number of names of minor features or microtoponyms, many of which are not recorded in later surveys. These are mostly names of natural features, burns and boundary markers. The Smithtown Dyke continues northward, on which are marked several waypoint features. The Craig at Watts Yet, the Flowford Stain, Giles Curragh, Yellow Moss Now, the Tippet Stain I' the Celt, the Curragh at Stubby Stannock, and Walker Wall Craig. Drawn, this latter one drawn as a substantial, probably natural feature, where the line of the dike, presumed dike, turns sharply to the east towards Upper Pyot Craig. Pyot here being the Pyot, the magpie. It's named for the magpie. These names, it's interesting that there are 2 Curraghs here. Curragh in Gaelic is a wicker basket or some such, and it's presumed that this is probably due to the shape of the feature rather than them being actual wicker baskets, obviously. The Tippet Stain I' the Celt is another slightly problematic name, but anyway, I'll leave you with that one for the moment. Some of these stains and curraghs may be the remaining meaths or boundary markers shown on an earlier schematic plan of Dulswinton running north from the Smithtown up to the Black Gap. This older schematic makes reference to a perambulation of Garleys and Closeburn of 1614. Note Garley's Shield Steads next to Garley's Moss on the 18th century plan. The Black Gape is also marked on the 18th century plan on the march with Auchen Cairn of Closeburn. You'll see the Black Gape to the north on the northern, this is the northern boundary of the disputed ground. And we're looking at something from east at the bottom and west at the top. The east side of the plan is not marked with as many boundary features as the west, but from the Black Gape, it runs along the side of Auchengeath Rig by the Bald Stain to Upper Pyot Craig, to the cairn on the Reed Hill, and thence by Garley's Shield Steads, which I've already referred to, by the Pedder Path to where that crosses the Gavine Burn, which is now the Duncow Burn. The Cocklick Burn and the Black Stand Burn meet to become the Gavine Burn below what is now Cocklet Hill. That's to say a hill where grouse have their leck. Gavine seems to be just a variant of the personal name Gavin, very improbably harking back to Hawk, but there's no suggestion of that here. But there are two Gallic watercourse names preserved on the plan that are of particular interest, I think. The first of these, Kilfarnock, is still the name of a cottage adjacent to Quarrel Wood, the present-day Quarrel Wood. The cottage probably took its name from the burn. I haven't had a chance to go and doorstep the inhabitants. So this is perhaps the name of a wood, Gaelic col, kill, that the burn ran from or through. Farnock is, of course, the older name in Gaelic, I think. I've got that right. So the Kilfarnock burn was already alias the Newlands burn on this 18th century plan at the time that the plan was drawn up. The second watercourse, the Knocknarrock burn, is now completely lost as a name and not found on any later surveys. But the fact that it's a knock suggests that it the hillock or the hill that the burn ran from was the Knocknarrock, but it's uncertain what the second element represents here. So finally, just to close, I would just like to stick my neck out here about Dalswinton itself as a name. It's a problematic name because it has the Gaelic Dal prefixed to what looks like an English or Germanic place name, Swinton. Either that, or it could be argued that it's Dalswin with a Germanic ton added onto the end of it. At the moment, my marginal preference is to say that it's a Gaelic Dal, which has been prefixed to Swain's Farm, much as Dalmellington is Melling's Farm with Dal prefixed to it at the almost the other end of Nithsdale or beyond. So there we are, some very interesting minor names, not otherwise preserved on modern or even 19th century mappings, which are of some interest, I hope. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Henry. That was really interesting. And we at Galloway Glens, we've got a place names project, which you have a look at our website and have a look at. And we've not mapped this area yet, but there's a whole library of place names we've created through Glasgow University, looking at things like field names, which tells such a history of what's gone back and the different languages used in the past. And your presentation actually finished perfectly there with ending on Dalswinton, because I believe our next map that's coming up, I'll be bringing up, is Mains of Dalswinton. And Graham, you're going to have a little bit of a chat about that. So Graham, would you carry on and I'll be quiet and try and find a way of sharing this map?
Certainly, yes. The Mains of Dalswinton map, which we're just going to look at now, which is just titled Mains, as you can see, has no surveyor attributed there at all, but the surveyor is actually William Macartney. And we know this because this map is one in a set, in a bound volume, and the bound volume is all by William Macartney. Now, William Macartney has cropped up before at damp meetings. He was quite a prolific surveyor, worked between 1766 and 1787, and probably a little bit outside that, both ends. And he was, so he worked at a time when there was a lot of improvement going on. There was a fallow period after his time, and he was about a generation earlier than John Gillen, who we'll come back to later. And he was an interesting chap. He was described, like quite a lot of the surveyors are, as a mathematician. And in fact, one of the very earliest surveyors of Dumfries and Galloway, Charles Mercer, who was active between about 1730 and 1750, was also described as a mathematician and was in fact a maths teacher at the grammar school in Dumfries. So Macartney's not that unusual. He was a local man from Knockshinnagh in Shorehead Parish, near Shorehead, and later went to live in Dumfries. And most of the maps that he did are of the Eastern Stewartry, Lower Nithsdale, that area. One of the interesting things about Macartney is his style, and I think Archie's going to say a little bit about this, but I'll just say it was unorthodox and also sometimes eccentric. Just the little cartouche there gives you a flavour of it. And I'm not actually going to mention any particular features on the map. I'll let others do that. But just to say that one of my theory is about why Macartney was not doing that many surveys after about 1780 is that people like Gillen, and in fact Gillen in particular, with his different style and his superior abilities as a draftsman and definitely as an artist, he was probably more popular with the landowners who chose people to do their work. So I'll leave it at that for this one.
Thanks very much, Graham. Andy, do you want to come in on that? Maybe give us a little bit of the history on Castle Hill and such like bits and bobs.
Yeah, I was going to comment on Castle Hill, which you can see in the centre of the map, just above the farm. And the curious thing about that is that isn't actually where the castle is located. We know where the castle is. It's Comins Castle. It's actually to the south of there. So it isn't, although it's called Castle Hill, it isn't where the castle is. But if this works, can't do it with screen share. But we do know that it is in the location where the Roman fort is and where there's a defensive enclosure of a prehistoric settlement. So what I'm wondering is whether or not there were, although they're now only known as crop mark sites on aerial photographs, whether or not at the point when the map was drawn, there was actually some physical representation of these 2,000-year-old features on the ground that led to that area being called or known as Castle Hill, that have now been, as a result of agricultural improvement, ploughed away. And that is actually what's reflected in the Castle Hill name rather than the location of the castle itself.
Oh, right. Thanks very much for that. Henry, would you like to come in on this one at the moment?
Yes, thank you. Yes, if you go to the bottom right-hand corner of the map, it follows on very nicely from the survey that I was talking about, because this is the new march between the estates, the estate of Dalswinton and Lord Nithsdale's land. So we have there the actual new march that was created as a result of the dispute. So I think cool. that's very interesting. Now, if we go up a wee bit from that, we have two slightly enigmatic things here. We have the name Rule Town, which means nothing to me whatsoever. And beyond that, well, what I mean is it's not otherwise recorded. And beyond that, we have Course Hill, which is also not otherwise recorded. But of course, what we do have, if we go down slightly to the left, is that we have Girth. And there was the site of the Girth cross, which was a prehistoric monolith, which had an inscribed early medieval cross on it. The last time I saw that, it was lying in a patch of nettles at the back of a byre in the farm steading. Now, whether that cross has anything to do with the with Course Hill or not is an interesting question. The only other thing I'd say is obviously there's no railway line running up the river valley on this map, and that the bends in the river are now represented by a couple of features. The one at the bottom left there by Coral Wood is now the Tooks, and the one, the very sharp bend to the left of your screen there is the lake, and the settlement beside that is now Sandbed. And it's very nice to see that they had a cider orchard, which I'm sure kept them very happy.
I see that it's made Max Knoll very happy anyway on that one. Thank you. Thank you, Henry.
Thank you.
I would just like to say a couple of things on this, and then we'll have a look at what's termed as the abstract on this, which is the note of the areas of each field. If we go in a little bit, just go into the main part, back to the orchard and the cider orchard. The thing that I'd like to point out is that this is very much the center of an estate, and it's also one that is being nurtured quite carefully, if you like, because there's lots of things going on. There's all the arable land around and about, but actually nearer the center here, we have an orchard, cider orchard. A little lower down, we have also a black willow, I can't remember what it's called, black willow isle. We're going to come on to what might be termed Saukyards at a later date this evening. But it's an indication that there were lots of elements to the farm and lots of ways of either gaining an income or of just using what you've got on the site to, what do you call it these days? Self-sufficiency is what they call it these days. And I think this is very typical of early 18th century estates. And we have other ones like Earlston particularly, and we're going to come on to another farm, Barwhinnock, which is similar again. But quite often you come across farms that actually are fairly boring and don't have these indications of self-sufficiency, shall we call it. And I think it's a feature of earlier 18th century rather than later. Right, if we could go to the abstracts, McNab, that's great. What I actually wanted to talk about here was that I think that McCartney's probably, I think the expression is away with the fairies when he gets his pen out. If we just go up to the top and have a look at the title. When in this day and age of 18th century, what you had were quite a lot of, how do you put it, writing handbooks, and you would have different scripts for doing different things, and different people would use different scripts. So there would be a secretary script, for instance, and a nice, thin, flowing, elegant Italian script would be fit for ladies to use, and all this sort of thing. But what you've got here, and quite often McCartney does make a meal of it, at the top you've got something which is elegant and Italianate, if you like, with what are referred to as knots around about it, or curlicues, which are just totally extravagant and unnecessary from a modern eye's point of view. And then lower down where it says mains, you have that is black text, or Gothic or German text, it was known as. There's kind of an optical illusion that goes on as far as I can see. If you go onto the NLS site and play with it yourself and go in really close to that capital letter, you'll find that the letter disappears altogether in a mist of swirls, and it doesn't really come together until it's further away from you again. But I find that sort of writing totally over the top and extravagant. If you look at the end of the title, it's even coming out of its boundaries, if you like, and it's just as well he actually put a margin around the page, otherwise maybe he would have lost some of the pen writing off the page as well. And then the main text is in a totally different hand again, or not a different hand, but a different font, if you like. But all the writing on these maps is quite exciting. Well, to me, it's quite exciting. One of the things that we should keep an eye open for is the fact that if you are going to engrave something, you find a lot less of these flowing hand-done bits of lettering, and it's always very much more utilitarian. So anyway, keep looking at the writing. It's great fun.
The next presentation is from Ruth Titness. Again, apologies if I've mispronounced that name. Ruth's been pretty big on botany in the area as well as rabbits. She's written a good amount of historical work, including and done an oral history of afforestation in Ayrshire. She's going to talk about the rabbit farming in Dumfries and Galloway. And over to you, Ruth.
Thank you very much. So, hello, DAMP members and friends. So, I'm doing something a bit different, and I'm going to introduce you to the European rabbit, how it reached Scotland from its native Iberia, and the methods I used to locate rabbit farms called rabbit warrens in Scotland. Archaeologists have found that in Spain, wild rabbits were eaten by Neanderthals 60,000 years ago, and by hunter-gatherers 13,000 years ago. Rabbits are reasonably easy to catch, prepare, and ready for cooking, and they feed 4 to 5 adults, as I'm about to show you. Can you see my rabbit ready for cooking? You can get 5 at least joints out of that. Their fur is also very valuable, and you can use their fat and sinews. And medieval nuns kept them as pets to keep them warm in bed. So rabbits have lived in Britain and Ireland since at least medieval times. My story starts with rabbits actually getting here. The Romans, when they invaded Spain, discovered a liking for rabbit meat, so they transported live animals to their colonies all around the Mediterranean coasts and islands, and they kept them in enclosures. A few Roman age rabbit bones have been discovered here in Britain, but archaeologists reckon they were just culinary specimens imported for a special dinner. The first written accounts date to the 12th century. For instance, Tavistock Monastery in Devon claimed rabbits as tithes from the Scilly Islands in 1176. Now, rabbits could have been brought to Scotland overland by monks and nuns, or by Scottish monarchs who spent time in the English court. Or perhaps they reached Scotland direct from Iberia, along the busy shipping routes from the Mediterranean via the many Atlantic coastal islands. Rabbits are really good boat passengers because you can feed them on hay, vegetable scraps, coastal plants, seaweed, and if you run out of rabbit food, they'll eat the wooden boat itself. The special feature of rabbits is that 1 rabbit or 2 rabbits can turn into a dozen rabbits during your journey. And I think they would also be much easier freight than cattle or sheep, as you can carry them in hampers or bags. You don't have to tie their legs up, etc. So farming rabbits, what about farming rabbits? Soon after 1200 AD, rabbits had become important food and fur animals in Scotland. And in Scotland, the earliest written records so far are from Coldingham Priory in 1225, Kingsmuir in Crail, which was a royal warren, and the Isle of May, which was also attached to the royal warren in 1329. Small islands were favourite places to develop rabbit farms because rabbits don't swim very far. Scottish rabbit islands included Craigleith and Bass Rock, Ailsa Craig, Little Cumbrae, and I think your own Heston, known as Estholm in the past. But inland, rabbits had to be confined within a warren or conygarth, rather as we keep cattle in an enclosed field. Monks, monarchs, and landowners built warrens. These could be a stone-lined pit, like a dry well, a small enclosure with a stone floor and walls. There's one in Falkland Palace. An artificial mound over dug tunnels called a pillow mound, and there's one at Waterbeck Kirkconnell, or a field with perimeter walls of turf or stone. And the rabbit farmer, called a warrener, made sure that plants like broom, furze, and juniper grew in abundance in the warren or nearby for both food and shelter. So I've mentioned islands and religious houses as places to search for rabbit warrens, and another place would be sand dunes, where the wild vegetation suited rabbit pallets. Hollows provided shelter and warmth. The soft sand was suitable for burrowing. And for instance, there's a written record of the Aberdeen commoners' rights to keep rabbits on their links in 1583. So to locate rabbit warrens in Scotland, I looked at many sources. And first of all, the landscape. And there are many landscape features that you can search, which give evidence of rabbits. And this is the pillow mound I was mentioning, which in this case is about 1 metre high and maybe 20 metres long. And on some of these warrens in Dartmoor and East Anglia, there may be 40 or 50 pillow mounds, but you can also get single ones. So as well as landscape, we can look at maps. Could I have slide 3, please? And this is a 17th century map of Carloverock. And it's actually shows the enclosure that other people have been mentioning, and a dotted line which says rabbit warren, which suggests that there was a rabbit warren there, but since enclosure it isn't there anymore. So that's my one example of a map, just the rabbit warren just north of Carloverock Castle. So next slide, please. And this is very difficult to read, but luckily the printed material at the bottom tells us that the second entry, written by Mary Queen of Scots in 1565, where she's asking for various animals to be bought for the household kitchen, and she mentions connings here, which is a old name for rabbits, and garennen, which is the French name for rabbit warrens or any sort of hunting enclosure. So that's a very interesting archive, and there are many more of different kinds, as you can imagine. Is an aerial view of Tor's Warren in Glen. There's the sandy beach. There's the Poltanton Burn here. There's modern forestry there. And this is where the warren, or in actual fact, 3 warrens at Paul's Warren, and it would have extended from the high tide line, probably to the Poltanton Burn, which provided a nice boundary. So one can also look at place names. And for instance, in English, Warren Hill, in Scots, Coney Island, in Gaelic, I've got to pronounce it right, Elan Nancoinian, of which there are quite a few, about 10 around the coast of Scotland. There are dictionaries, household books of monasteries, images like tapestries. So we can look at all those sources of information. Now, Dumfries and Galloway. I have found 19 rabbit warrens, or possible warrens. Compare Fife, which has 16, and Ayrshire, with its long length of sand dunes, which has 16. Lanarkshire, I've only found 5 so far. So in Dumfries and Galloway, there's Carloverock, Sand Mill Farm, also on the Glen Loose Sands, the 3 at Paul's Warren, and Drumlanrig, though I don't know the actual location yet. Then there are possible warrens, which I've got from place names mainly on maps. For instance, Warren Hill, Rabbit Warren at Drum Lane, north of Castle Douglas, Warren Park, field name at Colraven, and Porter Warren and Warren Bay. So there are quite a few more of those. And then possible rabbit warrens include where the Pillow Mound is at Waterbeck, Coney Island in the River Dee, which may have been the rabbit warren for Threve Castle or Tongland Abbey, and Keeley Warren, which I argue about with people who say it was not a warren, the name is wrong for that. So that's 19 definite or possible rabbit warrens in Dumfries and Galloway, which is a reasonable number compared with other counties. So much more investigation to do, because all I have done is look for the location of them, because I'm obviously time limited. I can only, for the whole of Scotland, just find the location of warrens. So can I encourage you all, looking and listening, to look at maps and landscapes in Scotland, and particularly in Dumfries and Galloway, to find more warrens or more detail on the warrens we know about. And to help you, I've got 2 sheets, one of which gives you a long list of landscape features by which to recognize rabbit warrens, and search terms in the several languages used in Scotland, words for rabbit and warren in several languages, which you can look for on maps. And there's a sheet full of those as well. So there are quite a lot to hold in your mind when you're analysing a map. As you can see, is a very nice bound stone for a warren boundary on Dartmoor, Warren bounds, on Headland Warren. And so there are all sorts of interesting features like this to be found if you look. So I hope you will. And that's all I've got to say for the minute.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, Ruth. Now, right at the beginning, you shared a dish, and entirely my fault. I didn't have you spotlighted. So for the sake of everyone who is in the audience, could you maybe lift that culinary delight up in the air? A little bit higher. That's perfect. Now, I used to cook rabbit a lot for my children when they were younger, and one of their favourite dishes was hot and spicy rabbit wings, which is a slightly different dish. But how are you going to cook that later?
I am going to bake it tomorrow in cider, Herefordshire cider.
Entirely what almost everyone in the comment section has been stating. I mean, it would be a great outcome for this meeting as well. So as well as having lots of people looking for rabbits and rabbit warrens, and helping Ruth in her quest, to maybe also have a little list of recipes which we can publish on our Facebook pages for other people to work out how to eat rabbit in a better way. So thank you very much, Ruth. That was really interesting. Our next presentation is with Alan Gibbs. Now, we're pretty lucky to have Alan with us. He's a pretty renowned scientist, but he started his career in the part of the world where I'm residing at the moment. I live in Lockerbie, but Alan hailed from Annan, and he started his life looking at the Roman forts, which sort of pepper this part of the world. He graduated from geology in Glasgow and then spent a bit of time wandering around the world digging up oil, from what I can see. He's been listed as one of the top 100 scientists in the UK, so that's about 12,000 places, or maybe 220,000 places above me. So over to Alan. I would like to hear your presentation.
Well, thank you for the introduction. Hello, everybody. A few years ago, we bought an old house just outside Dumfries called Hills Tower. And like lots of old houses, it comes with ghosts. And this one came with two particular lots of ghosts, migrants and maps. So here are a couple of the ghosts. Ghosts on the right, of course, these days, ghosts tend to be Americans looking for their ancestors. There's a guy called Charles Lowry, and his family came from this part of the world. And we're going to bring them together with the map on the left-hand side, which is a copy or a ghost of Dunbar's map, which was made by the McCulloch family in the 1770s. So we'll talk about the map first of all, because the map is actually what allows us to take Charles Lowry back to his home. So the map originally was held by the McCulloch family in their archives, and in the 1970s they lent it to a guy called James William, who actually was a tenant at Hills for a while. And James spent most of 1.5 winters copying this map in the old-fashioned way with a large sheet of tracing paper on top of it. So before Archie's took maps down to Carlisle to scan, it was possible to copy these old maps and to reproduce them. But it takes rather a long time, and James copied the fonts and the cartouche and all the detail on the map. So along on this map, there's a couple of keys, one of which actually gives you all of the details about how the land was used, whether it was arable land, whether it was meadow, whether it was pasture, bog, and where the dikes and so on were. And then all the land parcels of that in terms of acreage and who owned them and how much of each of the different types of land there were. So the McCullochs at the time were recording in excruciating detail on this map how the estate was used. So here we see a blow up of a bit at the left there. The names of the individual parts of the map are named. They're not enclosed at that time, but their acreage and given in a lot of detail. And also, if you look down at the bottom of that, Fellside is divided into two parts. There were two tenants there, a John Thompson and a John Carson. And those were holding tenants at the time that Chuck Lowry's family were in this part of the world. So here's the map. It's north is up the top on this map, but actually the map is held so that you're looking west as you stand in the tower. All these blue dots on the map, by the way, are where there are buildings in the 1770s. These are croft houses and little farming townships, which are scattered across the area of the estate on the map. There's about 45 of them. Two red dots in the middle is where Hills Tower is and where the Mains farm and the Mains of Hills is located today and also at that time. So Chuck Lowry, his family left the estate, and they have their family Bible with, so they know who they were, what their ancestral line is, and where they came from. And the Lowry family, they can trace back to the Hills estate, and in the Lochrutten session records in the church, we can trace Lowry's back to the 1690s. So a very old family in this part of the world, but they left at some point for America. So we know from the work that that Chuck's family were able to do by analyzing their own records, and also by looking at the records that were in the Ewart Library with the assistance of the archivists and the team there, that the family were living in Fellside. So, and the Lowry man who was on the estate at that time was a William Lowry, and for a large chunk of time he was actually on poor relief. So he wasn't one of the tenant farmers, he wasn't a paid employee, he was living in one of these small cottages. His son John leaves somewhere in the sort of 1740s, 1750s, and he goes off to work at Lead Hills and then up to Strontian and back to Edinburgh. And when he's at Lead Hills and Strontian, he's not working as a labourer, he's actually working as a clerk. So although his family was very poor and on poor relief, they were educated, they were able to read and write. And that, I presume, is why they had a family Bible with their names in it and their marriages and their deaths. In Strontian, he met up with a Highland lassie, and he married her, and they both went to America. And the next slide, please. So he became a settler in America, and at that time, arriving in America, you'd get a land grant somewhere out west. So he ended up with a little farmstead in Philadelphia. So he'd gone from being the son of a guy on poor relief somewhere on the Hills estate to wandering around Scotland looking for bits of jobs, and eventually save up enough money to emigrate to America and become a farmer. His own son, Walter Lowry, helped him on the farm initially, and then because he was literate again, they end up representing the other farmers in the area as they were arguing with the state about taxes, I presume. And Walter Lowry effectively stands for the Senate and becomes a US Senator and Secretary of State. And he and his father paid for that gravestone you saw Lowry leaning against in the graveyard at Lochrutten churchyard. So they're going back and remembering at that time their family roots back in the Lochrutten Hills area. Next slide, please. There we are. So here, if we actually look at the map in more detail, we can match up the map and the church records. So we know they came from Fellside. Fellside is the part of the estate which is just to the south of where the tower is, and a little crofting township. And the map shows, Dunbar's map shows a cluster of small houses there. And you can see that again on the insert on the right there, that's divided into the two parts, Johnson's part and Cunningham's part. And they were the tacksmen, if you like, who owned or the tenancies on these two parts. The Ward Moss on the right-hand side there you can see is a burn with these sort of ponds or lakes along it, and that's actually where clay was being dug out to help slake the fields that they were cultivating, but also the clay was used to build the buildings. And we can take Dunbar's map and we can put it down on top of a modern air photograph or Google Maps or something, and walk onto the little township and see where these buildings are. So here I brought Chuck along to the central one of those little cottages, and you can see that we're stood in the middle of a small house. You make out very faintly the pattern of its walls. So there, it's a little house which is about 10 feet across and about 20 feet long, and it's one of this cluster of little houses. There's no evidence of a stone footing to it, so this was a clay house. If you actually take a probe and poke it into these wall mounds, they're quite soft, and it's quite clear that there's no stone footings to it. This little house was a turf and clay building, and it probably looked like one of these. Here's a reconstruction from the Highland Folk Museum above there, and below it was a turf house from Ireland in the early 1900s. So it looked like one of these. So Chuck's family were cotters living on one of the tenancies on the Hills estate, and they were leaving the area because there was no work for them, and they would begin to seek their fortunes first of all in Scotland, then further afield. Okay, so after they had left, the 40, 50 little croft houses eventually vanish, and the McCullochs end up focusing their farming efforts on three main farms. The Mains of Hills in the center there. There's the Lochside farm and the Forside farm down on the bottom there. So at this point, we're actually seeing the estate moving from crofting agriculture into the sort of agricultural pattern you see in this part of Cucubrishire today. And you think that these clearances of people from these croft houses would lead to population decline, but in fact it doesn't. In Loch Rutten, if you look at the left-hand side of the little graph, there's about 500 people in the parish around about the time the Lowrys were leaving. It rises gradually to the 1850s, and it falls back to the present day population, round about exactly the same as it was in the 1700s. So the improvements in agriculture and the focus of the farming on one or two larger farms means that the people are actually moving, not necessarily away from the area. Some of them are, but some of them are moving into the designed and planned villages like Lochfoot itself. So thanks to the Lowry family for sharing this little story with us. The present day Lowrys are down there in the right-hand corner. This is Chuck's son and his grandchildren. Thanks to James and Pauline Williams for capturing all the information on the Dunbar map and tying it into some of the parish records. The Ewart Library and Dumfries Museum staff for helping the Lowrys sort of piece things together, and of course the McCulloch family themselves for sponsoring the map and then lending it later on to James and Pauline Williams. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alan. That was really interesting. And I think it's not that long ago that people were living in housing which we would look to see as very primitive and almost Neolithic. And quite shocking to see that. And I can understand why people would want to have left that sort of property, particularly if you're not finding work and employment in the area. But very interesting that it didn't form this collapse in the population necessarily everywhere that people think of. We're next going to move to the west, to Twynham. And I'm going to share a map provided by Archie's team that Graham's going to start off talking about. So over to you, Graham, whilst I start sharing.
Thank you very much. So the map we're going to look at this time is of the Barwinach estate. And it's just about to come up. There it is. So this is the cartouche. If we zoom out a little bit, we could zoom out a bit on that. That's it, grand. So you can see this is both the last two maps that we're going to look at are absolutely full of interest, chock full of interest. They're both really good. They're both by John Gillen that we've talked about before. And this one, as you can see from the thing that looks like the Edstone, if you remember the 2015 election, that the words are sort of carved on, the estate of Barwinach lying in the parish of Twynham, etc., property of James and McCulloch. In 1799 it was surveyed, and there's just a faint signature at the bottom of John Gillen. If he thinks this is the landscape around Twynham, I think he's sadly mistaken. It looks more like the Western Highlands or perhaps even the Norwegian fields, but never mind. But as you can see from this, he was a pretty good artist, and I think that was one of the things that put him forward when the landowners were looking for surveyors. So that's a little bit about Gillen and this map. Now, I'll show you one or two of the features of interest. If we go right into the middle of the map, and then focus in. That's it. That's it, quite right. One thing about this map is it's been heavily annotated and altered after the date of the map. And if you see the bit where it curves around and says Barwinock here, that house that's shown there is actually the current house, which was built in the 1840s and way after the map date. And also this steading here and a whole load of other things. In fact, it's a very confused picture we're seeing here because of all the annotations. That the house was described in Gifford's Buildings of Dumfries and Galloway as deliciously smart, which I like that. He wasn't full of praise for most houses in the region, so that's quite an accolade. That's all I'll say about that bit. But if we can now head down to the bottom right of the map, which is the area around Twynham Village. That's it. Keep zooming in a bit there and off and right a bit. That's grand. That's grand. And just up a little tiny bit. That's it. That'll do. So what we've got here is the village of Twynham. You can see village at the bottom there. And we have two roads coming into the village. One is the military road and the other's a toll road. Well, the military road, first of all, we've been having a go at Gillen, haven't we, about all the mistakes that he makes. Well, here's something he got right and the Ordnance Survey later on got wrong. He's quite right that this is the line of the military road from Carlisle to Port Patrick, which was built in the 1760s by Major Caulfield. That's the line it follows. But on the first edition of the Ordnance Survey for Kirkcudbrightshire from around about 1850, it shows it as running right to the north of this map in a straight line heading across Islington Moor, quite high up, and then down into Gatehouse. And that's actually a mistake on their part. And the reason they made the mistake, it seems, is that in 1757, the original plan for the military road was to take it on that route. But then they changed their mind because of probably the exposure of the area it was going through. It's high ground and it would have been subject to a lot of snow and rain, whereas this new route takes it down on a much lower level. So the Gillen's right and the Ordnance Survey's wrong, and that's a feather in his cap. The second bit is the toll road. Now, the toll road is particularly interesting. If we follow the line of the toll road to the left, and then look in particular in this sort of blue area here, and zoom in on that a bit. That's it. Zoom in on there. You can actually see that the toll road has been overdrawn over the top of this area, and the whole of this has been drawn in later over what the existing features of the map. So it's an addition. So why is that? Well, the map date is 1799. In 1797, a Turnpike Act was passed for the Stewardship of Kirkcudbright to build several roads, including the main road from Dumfries to Newton Stewart. And the work on that was started straight away. And one of the prime movers behind that work was a chap called Lord Dare, who was the eldest surviving son of the Earl of Selkirk, based at St Mary's Isle near Kirkcudbright, who had a huge influence on the development of the local area, especially during the improvement times. And he was particularly interested in the development of infrastructure to support the transportation of agricultural products. And we've actually looked at another map influenced by Dare down at Meikle Ross in a previous talk, which was also a Gillen plan. Now, what's this tie-up? Well, Lord Dare came up with an idea given to him, strangely enough, by Sir George Clark of the Clark Maxwells that we were talking about earlier on, to make it easier to transport materials around by reducing the gradient of the road and taking them on curves to keep the gradient down so that wagons could more easily move along, etc., etc. He came up with this idea, And then he appointed a county surveyor, and the county surveyor was John Gillen, and he was the first county surveyor appointed for the stewartry. So Gillen was directly involved in the implementation of Dare's ideas, of Lord Dare's ideas. And I think what's happened with this toll road is it was probably added a year or two after the map date, around about 1800 or 1801, and was put on by Gillen himself, because the hand is exactly identical to the other hand used in on the map generally. So that's my supposition, and I'm happy to be proved wrong, but I think we've got an actual case here of the surveyor taking active role in the development of the landscape and of the infrastructure, and that's where that comes from. And I think after that lot, I'd better shut up.
Good stuff, Graham. Right, Ruth, perhaps do you want to say a few words on this map?
Yes. Could we go back to the where you were looking just now on the blue area? Thank you. Okay, and just above the blue area and to the right is a name, Fulmart Yard. Now, I think a fulmart was a polecat or ferret. So what does this name suggest? There's not much sign of buildings for keeping such animals. Maybe they had done in the past and the name had kept, but polecats and ferrets, ferret being the domesticated version, were used from medieval times onwards for catching rabbits. You put the ferret into the burrow, and then you covered all the adjoining holes so that when the ferret got down into the burrow and the tunnel and the rabbit rushed out, you caught the rabbit in the net. And then you dealt with it as you thought best. And you had to look after your fulmarts and feed them and make sure that they were happy and bred and had exercise and somewhere nice to live. So that's one suggestion for that.
Thank you very much. I'm glad you found something to do with the rabbits on the map. I would like to chat through one or two things here on this map, and then I'll hand over to Alan, who has got an, how do you put it, an exotic way of showing off what's on the map. If we go to the middle on the right-hand side, there is what's known as a marl pit, and that little splodge there on the right. This is another one of these estates which looks to be busy, and it's 1799. It certainly seems to have been busy before all the overwriting started going on. And all these new roadways and the new house. I have a feeling that I think the house was built in 1830, Graham?
Well, I've seen 1830 and 1844 as two different dates. I'm not sure which is true.
Well, one end was built then and the other end was built the other. But it seems to me that quite a lot of the markings, probably not the road that Graham was talking about, but probably a lot of the markings are dated around about the 1830 time, and it's mostly been done in pencil. And but if we go back to the marl pit there, you can see just in the light blue on the right-hand side. And marl was what folk used rather than lime. Now, I find it reasonably extraordinary that we find a marl pit here at this date, at 1799, because by this time, I had thought that mostly people were using lime of one sort or another rather than the marl, because it was just heavy work. So I'm vaguely surprised to see the marl pit on the estate. If we move across to the left-hand side and nearer to the top a little bit, yeah, where those blue fields are, that'll do fine. If we look in there, and if we go in a little bit closer, we can see that we've got the land being divided up into 3 sections there. We'll just do the blue bit. And that was the 1799 version of doing things. But what's happened after that is that we've got those pencil marks, those horizontal pencil marks going through the other blue lines. Now, what it turns out is that those horizontal pencil marks are the ones that actually stayed. So there seems to have been a real, I was going to call it a revolution, but a real going over of the estate in the 1830s, when I think it went out of the, it's Macmillan's at the moment, isn't it, in 1799, and then I think it goes out of their holding. So it's a new family that's coming in and doing new and different things. But that's clearly shown on this map. I love it when somebody's drawn on the map in a double way like this. Right, I think enough from me. Now, Alan, do you want to have a play with this one and see how you go?
Yeah, just leave it there for a minute. If you go back to that last view, please, Nick, zoom back in again. Archie's mentioned the Marl Pit. There's a couple of place names in here called Claycroft South and Claycroft North, which are worth just noting.
Just down a bit from there.
Just down a bit. And if you just stop there for a minute, just at the top in the middle now, you can see there's a Claycroft North and a Claycroft South. Don't move your map, just keep it there, please. And then right directly above that, near the top, there's a place called Saukyard. We'll come back to Saukyard in a minute. You point to Saukyard for us, Nick, please, straight up near the top. Keep going, keep going. There we go, Saukyard. Right, we'll come back to Saukyard in a minute, but first of all, the clay place names and the marl place names, what they're telling you about is that people are using the land here to mine or quarry some of the natural resources. And they're going to use these not just to improve the soil for the farming, but clay and marl are used as building materials, as they were for the Lowry's little houses. But also, when people started building stone houses, they packed the inner part of the stone house with clay or marl, and then just used the lime mortar on the outside to give weatherproofing. The room I'm sat in this farmhouse in Ayrshire has got a clay packing in the interior of the walls. So those are important resources for people building houses. Another thing on this map is that you can see that a lot of the hill features are little roundy mounds, very smooth roundy mounds. And as a geologist, that tells you something. These are quite different features. They're actually glacial features. So if I could have the slide, please. Slide man. This is the geological map of Twineholm. And this is not the bedrock map. The bedrock is the dark purple there. This is actually what's called the drift map. So this shows the glacial deposits. Those of us who are interested in the bedrock would call this the map of shit and small stones. So the blue things here are Boulder Clays. And you can see that they actually are, the Boulder Clays are forming these hills called the Dune. Just to the south of Barwinock there, and then to the left a bit is that big long one that Archie was pointing at. And the yellow things are sands and gravels. And the sands and gravels are actually stuck up in the hillside. So these are actually glacial features where the meltwaters were flowing over the wasting ice sheet and filling up the glacial meltwater channel with sand and gravel that had been eroded out of the ice itself as the ice had collected that. And when the ice melts, they end up stuck up in the hillsides as little linear moundy features. So you can get sand and gravel in these as well. So that you can actually use these for building with. You can use them to build warrens out of for roof. And you can also use the willow from the Saukyard to make your traps when you push your ferrets down the rabbit holes to catch the rabbits as they pop out again. Anyway, here's a Saukyard. This is a modern Saukyard between the just south of Thornhill, just before you come to Girth. And these are willows that have been coppiced for the willow staves. And you can see they've been laid out there. And just further along to the right here, they haven't been coppiced, they're growing on for another year there. And these willow poles will be split and used to make hurdles, baskets, or whatever. So the Saukyard on the previous map will look just like this, not with a wire rylok fence around it, but probably a hurdle fence around it. So that's what Saukyard is. Okay, thank you. That's me on that one.
We're moving on now to the final map of the session. So Graham will take over here, but we're now looking at some things down near the Kirkcudbright area. So Graham, would you like to introduce this map, and I'll start sharing it?
Certainly. This is a map of Borland, which is just on the edge of modern Kirkcudbright, and it's another John Gillen map, and it will be appearing any minute now. One of Gillen's absolutely finest maps. He's taken a great deal of care over this. If we zoom into the cartouche, there we go, and have a look at the whole of that. Just down, sorry, and down a bit, please. That's it, grand. You can see how beautifully that cartouche has been done. A great deal of care. The map also is of very high quality. So why did Gillen spend so much time and care on this map? Well, it belongs to the borough of Kirkcudbright. James D.L. of Barn Crosh was the Lord Provost of Kirkcudbright. There's a couple of Baileys, and the map was drawn in 1795. Well, for one thing, just off to the left of the cartouche, sorry, you don't need to move it because there's nothing there, is where Gillen lived. He's from this area, and he lived on the estate of Cumston. He had a house and a few acres there at this time. So that's one reason, but it's not the most important reason. We mentioned when we were looking at the previous map that Gillen became the first county surveyor of the Stewartry. And the people who are responsible for the county surveyor's post were the commissioners of supply, basically the big landowners of the region. And James D.L. of Barn Crosh wasn't just the Lord Provost of Kirkcudbright, he was also one of the commissioners of supply. In other words, he was one of Gillen's employers. So Gillen would have wanted to impress him. Also, Gillen was at this very time preparing a map of the whole parish of Kirkcudbright to be used in the statistical account, the first statistical account. So that's another reason. So there were plenty of things going on there, and Gillen was really, like I say, trying his best to impress with this map, and I think he did a very good job. One other thing I was going to mention on the same lines, if we go across to the right hand side of the map to the compass rose, that's it. And if we go, that's it. And you can see this compass rose, a nice compass rose, but it's also got the magnetic variation shown. You can see, I'm pointing at it, there we are, that's it. 26 degrees, 30 minutes of variation in 1795. He doesn't normally, on any of these estate maps, we don't normally get that sort of detail. So what's it there for? Is it any particular use? for the people using this map? Probably not, but it's to show that Gillen knew this and that he was a man of science and a man of knowledge. So that was another, I think, point of him trying to impress everybody. So that's what this map is all about from the surveyor's point of view, and other people want to chip in.
Right, thank you very much indeed, Graham. This is going to be a bit of a free-for-all, so I'm going to just do a little bit and then let other people have a shot. Can we go back to the cartouche again? But let's have a little look at that ship at the bottom. This is and just the writing above it, we will see it says in Latin, the seal of the borough of Kirkcudbright. And it's a very fine, Gillen loves his ships. Any chance of putting a ship on a map and he'll be doing it for some reason or another. And this one is nicely drawn, waves look proper, and all the rest. Now, funnily enough, DAMP has all sorts of experts on call, and so I gave our flag expert a shout to have a look at the flag here. And it turns out to be a Commodore's flag, which should normally be flown from the mizzen mast. But here, and normally you would fly your country flag at the back. Now, we did away with the idea that it might be either a Swedish or a Danish flag for obvious reasons, and decided that it probably was a Commodore's flag and that it was sitting there in the back end of the boat where it shouldn't necessarily be for artistic reasons rather than anything else. What's interesting is by 1890, the seal has lost the cross on the flag because it's the cross of St. George. And then by 1920s or whenever it is, they come to have the seal that they currently have, which is some sort of medieval craft with St. Cuthbert holding the head of St. Oswald or some such, which is the current coat of arms for Kirkcudbright. This was a common coat of arms for seaports. And my thought is that in Kirkcudbright, this is just a speculation merely, when smuggling was rife, this was a very small effort to put, as it were, the stamp of authority on Kirkcudbright merchants. But I'm happy for people to disagree. Anyway, be that as it may. Who's gonna take up the story? We'll leave Alan till last again, I think. So
can I say something about the names?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, well, the map is of a boreland, which is usually a boardland. In other words, it's the land that provided food for a caput or a main part of an estate. It's a medieval sort of version of a mains, I suppose. And on each side, we can see on one side there's the Cas of Culduch, and on the other side there's also Culduch, the actual settlement of Culduch, which is now Culdoach, where there is, not marked on this plan, but on the Ordnance Survey map, there's a motte. And so it's suspicious that the boardland was probably the boardland for that motte, whatever was there at that time, and that the whole thing belonged to an estate called Culdoach. Now, the interesting thing about that name, of course, again, is that it's Gaelic, and that it means the nook of the salmon trap. a duck is a salmon trap across a river. The earliest mention of that I could find is in a grant of 1609 when the Dundrennan Abbey lands were being carved up, and that was amongst the properties that was given to John Murray in 1609, was a cool dock. And I think this must be the cool dock that is referred to in that 1609 charter. So it didn't belong to Tongland. It apparently belonged to Dundrennan, which is not so far off. And there's a couple of other properties nearby that are also mentioned that belong to Dundrennan. Just quickly, a couple of interesting field names, which I've got no idea at the moment where they what they refer to. There's a South Kelpin Hole and a North Kelpin Hole. Now, I don't think this refers to a sea monster, the Kelpie. I think it must be something else, but I don't know what. And I think somebody, it was maybe Alan the other day, mentioned the Herries Slaughter Field, which stands to the near the How of Herries, yes, and the number 14 next there is the Herries Slaughter Field. And next to that is Butts Park, which is highly amusing, but in fact is where they would have had the archery butts, where they would, where no doubt the people who were defending Kakubri could come and practice their archery skills. There's a number of very interesting features about this map, but I've probably said enough.
I'd like to follow up on that one from Henry on the How of Herries Slaughter. Although Graham said that this was being done at the same time as the old statistical account, the first one, the new statistical account makes reference to inroads into the territories of Douglas of Thrieve by Sir John Herries during the reign of James II. But Herries was defeated in battle and was executed as a result of his actions. So this probably relates to that particular incident. And then if you just head up and right a bit from there, you'll see that Gillone has noted a Roman camp. This is in fact, in relation to the previous Barwinock map, this is actually a case where both Gillone and the Ordnance Survey get it wrong because they both put them down as Roman camps, whereas in fact this is actually a native late prehistoric fort. And if you go back, if anybody goes back onto the NIS website and looks at the Barwinock map, they'll see that the Dune at Twynham is actually down as an ancient British fort on Gillone's map, and he's correct in identifying that. He has the moat at Twynham down as a moat, though actually he means motte, so it's a mound rather than a body of water. And then just to the south, there's a second feature that he's noted as a moat, which is round and like a motte, but actually happens to be a prehistoric fort that is contemporary with the Dune, rather than a medieval moat that's contemporary with the motte in Twynham.
Excellent.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Who would like to come in next, Peter or Ruth? Okay,
I could say a little bit, but for some reason tonight, as an ecologist, I'm talking about engineering, but never mind, I'll continue. If we go and have a look at the court with the river just below the Cartouche, if you zoom right into the riverside there, you'll see that this map is another one which has been altered at a later date, because you can maybe just make it out there. It says new course of embankment, and it's been penciled in along the edge where the embankment is today. That's where I walk my dog 2 or 3 times a week. It's a well-known footpath in Kirkcudbright. But you can tell this has been added on because the fields beside it, number 6 and number 5, if you were to read the description of those fields, it said covered by high tides. So they're certainly not covered by high tides, unless they're very high tides. Today, the embankment stopped the tides going that far up. Just one other engineering feature, just go down a little bit further from there. Keep going down, where it goes to Walkmill Croft. And you can see there that there's 2 roads. The one on the west side is where the current road is, but the other one, just above Walkmill Croft, isn't a road anymore, and hasn't been a road since about 1840 or whenever it is, because that's where they built the railway line. It's interesting that they built the railway line directly on top of the old road.
Can I ask, Peter, is that the burn that runs past the Walkmill, is that the Ball and Burn?
That is the Ball and Burn, yes. The Walkmill, which is a textile mill, isn't there anymore, unless you're prepared to go and dig around amongst the trees beside the Ball and Burn, and you can still find some stones of the old Walkmill. And so it was already gone, obviously, by the time that this map was being produced.
Ruth, have you got anything to add on this map? Ruth?
Yes, I think it's all been very well covered by other contributors.
Right. Okay. Just before I hand on to Alan, if we go back to where Peter was with the embankments, just up a little bit. Yeah. If we have a look here, you can see going up the Carse Burn, there is Horsewell Strand, and then the Horse Well. Now, the reason that's if we can go back in again, the reason that's there is because this was an offloading point, presumably, for boats, and that wasn't just where horses went to wash their hooves in the salty sea. That was probably where boats actually came up and got offloaded. And the Horse Well there will have been the drinking place, what do you call it? Service station, if you like, for the horses coming in. You're talking about boats that were offloading somewhere in the region of 15 to 20 tons only at a time, but on the other hand, the carts were only carrying about a ton at a time. But so that road would have been really quite busy. If we go up to the top briefly, and we can see the just to top left there, Tungland Port. Now that was the place where the certainly lime came in for everywhere up the Galloway Glens, and also the shells that were harvested from the various bays down in the Kirkcudbright estuary. So we normally think of ports as being a big place with a quay next door to it, but in those days we're talking about wee places where you'd park your boat as the tide went out, unload it, and as the tide came back in again, you would float it off again. Right, Alan, maybe you'd like to finish this up for us.
If you could zoom out. Okay, if everybody looks down at the bottom of the map, as you can see it on the screen now, you can see there's these linear woodlands, and also a lot of the rivers are also sort of going sort of top left, bottom right. And it's a very regular pattern across this map, and you wonder why that might be so. Right. So what I've done here is I've got in the bottom right there is just a little bit of the map you've just been looking at. And then underneath that and over the rest of it is the Geological Map of Tungland. And these red tongues, these red lines are actually intrusive dikes, because this area sits above a buried granite, and the rocks above the granite are being stretched and they're breaking up like chocolate tablet or along stamp perforations. So you get these orthogonal tears, top left, bottom right, and then sort of bottom left, top right, and then top left, bottom right. And the ones at the bottom there, the dikes are forming poorer ground, little ridges that are not good for agriculture, and that's where the trees have been left, forming those like little linear woodlands that are coppiced, presumably, with some bigger trees on them. So always look at the geology underneath. The geological maps, by the way, you can find on the British Geological Survey website, and you can have a look at the maps for the whole of the UK.
Many thanks, Alan. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we've just about come to it. There we are. It says the end. Thank you very much indeed for tuning in and for doing so in, I think all the Galloway Glens boys have gone to bed.
Not quite. I'm going to make it for you, Matt.
Fair enough. But a big thank you very much indeed to Galloway Glens for sorting us all out again. And more especially, or as well as, to all our contributors this evening. So thank you very much indeed, everybody.